Starting my time in 3, 2, 1. Look, much of the other sides have talked about quabbling over what the definition of a minority is and trying to get pie in the sky in terms of arguments over discourse. This speech and MO is going to be very simple. First, a little bit of framing about what this type of deplatforming stuff looks like. Because I think we get some argumentation that, oh, this probably comes out, like there's equal cancellation on the right, there's equal right-wingers trying to deplatform, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this argument is not true to the extent that most of society is naturally conservative anyways, or these people already hold positions of power. So the type of deplatforming that you get from these like disparate, decentralized movements is more likely to come from like local left center advocacy groups trying very hard to shut down very, very conservative people. And no, this isn't just talking about normal conservatives, because the way deplatforming succeeds is not just by the far left in isolation, but when the far left reaches out to the center left, which only happens in the most extreme cases, right? So you have that allyship to have mass support for trying to push these people off a university platform. I also want to be clear about what the comparative is, right? Because the comparative that government tries to go for is, oh, you get good dialogue, you're able to have some level of discourse, you're able to have some level of engagement, etc. But that just doesn't happen, right? And I think just empirically, the comparative is more likely that protests that often occur, that often turn violent. You're not going to get the types of dialogue the government wants to talk about. You're going to look like shouting past each other. You're going to like active debate, hyperpolarization, et cetera, et cetera. So first, I just want to respond to a couple of claims that come out of CG, right? Because the first thing that they say is that, oh, you need to enter the real world at some point. These people need to grow up and face this music anyways. One, just because even if you buy that the premise is two, they don't show why this is necessarily the best way to do it, i.e. why you ought to be thrown into the deep end of the most polarized discourse out there rather than just like talking with a more conservative person or being exposed that way and like trying to have more natural inclinations. By government's own logic, these type of people that hold these really inflammatory opinions are the minority of society anyways. So even if you go your life without engaging with them or talking with them in a meaningful point, then I'm confused of what you're actually losing out on, because most people that engage with society don't hold this opinion, also condemn it by government's logic, so you're not really losing out that way. The second thing that they say is, oh, it makes right-wingers feel like victims at the point where they're not able to engage in university platforms. One, probably good thing if their rhetoric is super bad, right, or super inflammatory, or has the potential to be racist. Secondarily, these people are oftentimes come from positions of power in the first place anyway, so they have stuff to fall back on, as O like tries to point out very flippantly, which is why like they do this anyways, because the like making themselves feel like victims, making themselves feel like they're the hero of their own story, so what galvanizes them to get support in the first place. So we think this argumentation is going to be symmetric. And then the last thing with equal cancellation on the left actually is going to be like this entire issue is going to be avoided by extension, which I'll get into right now. So what is the extension here? First, I think I want to very clearly state what happens when you don't have deplatforming, and why is the comparative low, or why is the comparative far, far worse? So what is the comparative? I think it's two things. One is that you force people to join into particular blocks. What does this look like? When you have a really conservative speaker coming, it creates a polarized environment on campus. It literally means that groups advocate for and against the speaker in various ways. So it's like being forced to pick sides. It creates an us versus them narrative that impacts the vast majority of individuals in the university. But when you have deplatforming, you have comparatively more allyship. Why is this the case? This is probably really important for allyship for minority communities because it allows for more nuance and more coalitions. Like, look, the main push from OG is that, oh, this is really important for discourse and really important for talking about issues. But into the time-sensitive and often rushed nature that these speaker events occur in, this discourse often just becomes, do you support this issue or not? And only in that particular binary. At the point where you don't have this, then you allow for more gray area opinions to emerge. You allow for more for people to potentially reach out to you because they see that there's more nuance in the conversation. They're able to form in you. It doesn't feel like they're picking you at the cost of picking someone else. You're able to have allyship as a whole. But the second thing I want to say, which is really important, is that the comparatives oftentimes, when you invite these speakers, when you don't deplatform them, it often just turns into the real world, it often just turns into physical protests, physical situations, etc. This often consists of direct or indirect clashes between groups. Like when Ben Sabir shows up to campus, I think OG paints a far, far brighter of a picture, right? It's not just that stuff happens in a building off campus and everyone goes about their day. What it means is that there's protests and rallies beforehand, right? It's not just the speaker event, it's the lead up to that, it's the demonstrations before that occur after that as well. There's probably lots of demonstrations and physical confrontations at the door. And the most important thing, right, is that this creates lots of tension and volatility where the risk of escalation is non-zero and most importantly, unpredictable. This is why the gov argumentation for, oh, this is a building that people can consent into going to the building or not falls out of the wrap. Because even if you do not come to the event, even if you meaningfully, like by the best case, consented to not being able to go to the event, you cannot consent into something that you didn't know about. You cannot consent into something that just happens spur of the moment in terms of a ripple effect that happened before the event, after the event, et cetera, et cetera. I cannot consent into a really energized right-winger inspired by his speaker coming to campus and shouting slurs in class. I cannot consent into walking by a physical protest that happens on campus that I did not know about. What are the impacts then? And why is this really, really bad? First, and just the cleanest way CEO wins this round, we just resolve the issue and the top half clash about which minorities we particularly care about, right? Because OG cares about right-wingers who feel in the minority. OO cares about other vulnerable minorities. We tell you that regardless of which minority you care about, both of them probably feel more alone and more alienated when you have protests break out, when it breaks into an us versus them mentality all the time. Both of them probably feel like their friends are turning on them, that they might have their safety threatened when they come to campus, etc. We just tell you this is bad for both inherently groups, so we resolve that clash there. But second, we just get the most certain impacts, right? Because I think by OG's own logic, we're unsure about the results of this research. And importantly, in order to buy OG's logic, this can be the only place where research comes out of. But given that there are things like think tanks, independent lobbying centers, private donors funding independent study research, etc., I think they could probably access the research benefits anyways, right? Which, however, on our side of the house, the impacts are the most unique there and the most direct impact that you could have. Because just look empirically at processes that happen at Berkeley when you invite in particular speakers, or the type of polarization, or the type of weight that people put into themselves when they have this type of like controversial speaker come to campus, etc. Before I move on with the rest, I'll take OG.
Per the info slide, cancel culture includes things that aim to deplatform people, meaning that the protests that CO are against are something we can also stand against on our side.
So by your own, in terms of the protests, in terms of what happens when you invite these people there, you can be against a particular speaker there, but you're not sure about the ripple effects that happen there. That's why there's a meaningful discrepancy in terms of what you consent to or when you support it not to the extent it still stands. Second thing I want to say before, in terms of this discourse, is just how does it affect discourse and social issues? First, what is the problem right now? Right now, there's a problem of lack of scrutiny. If you're successful, you get a pass in society. If you put your work under the guise of research, then you get less or more of a pass. This is really important because a lot of the time, these people are put in positions of power, TEDx talk, university speaker sessions, other types of important public positions like research, etc. What changes then when you have deplatforming? One, I think you hold people accountable for the past words, because I think a lot of the rest of the debate focuses on really, really famous examples of cancel culture, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, etc. But there's also a lot of people that have said inflammatory stuff in the past, but people don't know about. They're not on Fox News every day, so you're not able to engage in that particular discourse or not. This stuff, at bare minimum, just exposes people and forces people to justify their past words, constantly defend them, even if it ends up not being like super, super racist, and you need to like you're still able to speak. Having more people acknowledge the context in which you come from is good because it's just more information, more accessibility of what the nature of this talk is into, which is meaningfully good because if you have more information, then people can more meaningfully consent to. But even so, if like the deflagging doesn't work, you hold people more accountable to their words. So you have a more nuanced and contextualized conversation that comparatively wouldn't happen on their side of the house when you don't have this information actively come out and you don't have more of an engaged, nuanced debate. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank you very much for your speech. And now, to some of the debate from side of the government, I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the government.
Hello, am I audible? Perfect. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Look, when it comes to the opposition side, I am genuinely unsure why students are the best actors to decide what is right and what is wrong. Note that platforming tends to be student-led movements, and most students are 18, 19 years old and don't know everything. We say that university is the best place to be able to have these discussions and have these conversations insofar as these conversations are still going to exist. It is uniquely on our side where you're able to get those critical discussions for people that don't necessarily know everything about minority experiences, for people that don't necessarily know all of the nuances about the world and all of the nuances about academics. Responses to CO, responses to OO, why Kate wins the debate and why that weighs over opening government. Responses to CO, I think the main thrust of their extension is the concept that protests and rallies are going to happen and there's going to be lots of confrontation on campus, and that is really, really bad. 4 responses to this. First, I think this might be the case in the most extreme cases. I am unsure why opposition are only going to talk about the most extreme cases. We say in the vast majority of cases, no platforming tends to be not just the Ben Shapiro's or the really, really bad racist racists or the neo-Nazis. It tends to be about things where there tends to be like a degree of gray area that people don't necessarily know what about. Secondly, look, just status quo COVID, who's on campus, who's processing. That's a glib response, but it's funny. Third, campuses usually have extensive amounts of security, meaning that giving like the duty of universities to protect students, even if there are protests, this isn't necessarily a bad thing or as big of an impact as opposition claim. That means that it's not going to be this massive shit show because you have security there that is able to protect you, right? Fourthly, I think this is, I think equally on the other side, you get campuses get protests at the point at which they specifically non-platform certain people, because then you get other people coming out to protest being like, why have you no platform this individual? I think like the case of protest is symmetrical, doesn't win them the debate. Next thing, CEO tell us, why do we have to throw these individuals into the deep end? I don't think this is actually the point of the Kate's argument, and it's actually kind of a strong. Firstly, we think for a lot of individuals, the ability to be able to face the racist or to be able to face the person that you view as the oppressor can be seen as very, very cathartic. Note that we get this from CEO and OOs. We get this generalization of like minorities, and all minorities are going to feel really, really attacked. Note, not all minorities are the same. Kate is not the same as every other woman. I am not the same as every other Black person. That means for some people, it is a really nice thing to go up and actually tell that individual about your lived experiences. Why is this really, really important? Because note, oftentimes when like a racist or when like a sexist or a transphobe meets someone that is from that community, they are not as likely to be as like, they're more likely to be like equitable in the way that they share their opinions, because now they're confronted with that individual and they are now more able to have that conversation. That never ever happens on opposition side, because now you're literally viewed as like the victim because you've been no platformed by this university, and you go on this press tour saying that you are this massive victim, and you essentially become a celebrity, and like you only get interviewed by like right-wing media like Fox News. And that means that like on your news feed you still see this racist person, and you still see this person that's really, really bad, but you don't have the ability to be able to respond to them and to be able to talk to them. For some minorities, that is something that you really want, just to be able to explain to someone why their opinions are wrong. And we think universities are the safest place and the best place to be able to facilitate this. I think I've also responded to pretty much on that. Note, and I pointed this out in the POI at the start, these opinions are going to exist on either side. Why? One, because of the analysis that I gave about like these individuals like literally going on press tours and being interviewed by Fox News. Secondly, because the internet and things like Reddit and Twitter exist. What does that mean? That means that when you don't have like these individuals speaking in universities, it's going to be significantly harder to get the critical engagements with those opinions. What does that mean? That pushes people to become even more extreme at the point at which, firstly, that individual is presented as the victim, so you feel a greater solidarity towards that individual rather than the minority group. But secondly, because you never ever get that chance to respond, right? You don't have clips from the Cambridge Union put up on YouTube about people having like a debate where you're picking out the nuances of each claim and each argument, right? Now you just have that person literally just shouting all the time on Twitter and on media, and they get lots of followers and like lots and lots of backing, and they're painted as the victim. So now they're more likely to get even more followers, but also they're less likely to be vetted, right? Because we say that obviously universities don't want to incite violence, so you probably have an incentive not to bring on like the racist person that you know is going to incite violence, but you're probably going to vet the one and like bring on the one that you know is likely to be more critical and actually engage with the discussion, because universities also have an incentive to want people to keep coming to their universities, and it's not good if you're seen as the university that incites violence. We're going to say the media doesn't necessarily have those same incentives because they're protected by all of the money, and oftentimes they don't rely on all of that government funding, and they don't have the same social responsibilities that universities actively do. Next, they tell us, these no platform groups are like really, really efficient, and they're not stupid, and they're going to be so effective. I am just unsure as to why this is true. As per the analysis I gave at the start of my speech, a lot of these are very, very young students that generally don't really have that much of a conception about the world, right? Note in the vast majority of universities, it tends to be from like the privileged group, and like it tends to be like white people from more privileged rich families that are claiming to speak on behalf of these minorities, and they do the same thing that opposition does and claim that, we're protecting the minorities. Sometimes we just don't fucking want your protection, and sometimes we want to engage with these issues ourselves. I think think it is like objectively wrong for opening opposition to claim that, oh, we're protecting all of these minorities without actually giving minorities the chance to be able to speak for themselves, or the chance to be able to choose to opt out of those situations for themselves. So I don't think they get their claims of being able to protect minority groups. Next thing, which is very, I lost my notes. Next thing, yes. The right wing. Look, note that this is a very, very broad thing and this becomes the norm. Note that this goes unresponded to. When you have consistent no platforming in like left-wing universities, and this is also part of our extension, I think this also becomes the norm in right-wing universities. Why is this the case? Because now they have an incentive to be like, they're not listening to us. Why should we listen to them? What does this mean? At the point at which you're no longer actively no platforming, that means you can actively criticize these right-wing institutions and be like, hey, why are you guys still no platforming like left-wing thinkers when we're platforming your thinkers? Now that means that these conservative communities have more access and have significantly greater amounts of information. These are the communities that need it the most, and these are the communities that need to engage in that debate the most. We think we've extended over opening government because we've explained to you the broader political impacts that don't just rest within like the research or like the general like left-wing like sort of liberal media. Because of that, I think we win this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much for a speech. And now I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the opposition.
Cool. Yeah, actually, I'm going to revert consent from streaming. Can